Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us on the April Risk and Complexity Special Interest Group Forum. So this month we're looking at managing complex risk networks on major projects. So today we've got one speaker, Jonathan, Professor Jake Ansell of the University of Edinburgh. So he'll be discussing complexity and strategic asset management on major nuclear projects. And then the second part of the forum, the event, we're going to be looking at the risk and complexity section of the upcoming PRAM guides. So there's been a request from the APM for input from the complexity SIG. So we'll review that in the second part of the session and invite input from the participants. So there's a PDF version of it available for downloads on the call platform, so you'll be able to download your own version of that and review it in your own time or on your own screen.
So we've got 17 people already. Should we just give it another minute or two and see if we get any more?
Yeah, I think it's worth doing. Okay.
Can't actually see who we've got on, but hopefully we'll be able to find a list of people at some point as to who's joined us.
Yeah, so if you've got the staff tab within attendees, and then you've got the attendees tab, which should detail the attendees for you, Mike.
I can't see that.
Mm-hmm.
Oh well, if you can see it, Graham, that's great. And thanks to everybody for joining.
Hey, shall we make a start?
Yeah,
I'm happy to.
Great. Thanks, Jake.
Okay, yes, I'll hand over to Professor Jake Ansell, who will give us a bit of an introduction and talk us through his slides.
Okay, I'm Jake Ansell, and it describes me to a certain extent, this slide. I have a role within the business school, which is on impact and knowledge exchange. It says I taught statistics. I've also taught risk management, and I've been working in risk-related subjects since 1976. And I'm a consultant in statistics, but also dabble in other things. I'm sorry, I think we're going to have to say next slide. Oh yeah, sorry. So if somebody would drive the slides. All right, I'm going to talk about strategic asset management, which is a little bit away, you might think, initially from complexity, but hopefully I will give you the indication of why it is complex, because it's not a simple activity, it's a major issue. I think next slide would be useful. All right, what we're going to be looking at is a large site which is entering its decommissioning phase. It's obviously a complex site by the very nature of the business one's working in, and it's a rather congested site, this particular one. It is crowded into a limited area. There are a huge number of underpinning infrastructures associated with all the assets that are on the site, and we have a quantity of very and extremely dangerous materials around. And essentially, the whole goal of this site is to move in the next 120 years or less to achieve a greenfield site, so that there is nothing left of the site, no remainder in the current context, and that is the desire. So moving over that 120 time, then what we've got is we need to create a strategic asset management plan, which is going to deliver the overall corporate goals. Not an easy task if you think we're talking about trying to plan something over 120 years and we don't know what will change in the interim. There may be good news and there may be bad news into the future. It's certainly, this site will perhaps be expensive to the exchequer for a while, and the achievement of a good price for the actual whole project would be desirable. And the whole point of a strategic asset management plan is to ensure the corporate mission is achieved. There's no issue with that. Everybody agrees with that, but you need to have some way of putting it into practice. You start with the current perception of the site and all the facilities that are on it, and then you don't go for an ultimate solution. You don't go. You just think, how are we going to improve it? Say in the short term, in the next year, in the next 5 years, and then what's going to happen after that? And clearly, what you can't do at this stage is do something which is going to impact on people's ability, say, in 10 years' time or longer. It is plausible to mobilize the resources, provided they can be justified, but that resource base is again composed of human activity as well as the physical state of the property, of the assets, because all the time the humans might be changing, because the needs and requirement of the corporation is such that it will need to change some of the staff or a large part of the staff over clearly 120 years, but also the physical assets are changing. And, you know, the decay and the issues around materials are going to be such a problem. And when you start thinking about it, you have got senior management, the board and the people below the board, who will have views and opinions on what should be happening. And clearly, if you're going to construct a plan, you've got to get them on board. You've got to bring them into that situation, because if they're not on board, then it ain't going to work. And that is a feature. But also, given the dynamism that is going to be required in the changing, then it's also going to be need to bring staff on board so that the staff are fully in line with the actual desire of the plan. And as I emphasize, clearly over that period, we're going to have lots of change in staff. Turnover of staff will be particularly an issue. We also will need specifically a change in the mindset of the organization as it moved out of one activity, which it's been doing for an endless number of years, into a totally different context, a totally different environment, and with different aims and goals. So that is the whole point. It also suffers from the fact, and I haven't emphasized this, but nuclear plants, wherever they are, suffer from the number of regulators that are involved with them. So you have regulators, environmental agencies, and other regulators who will want to be involved. So that it is very crucial to think about all that outside environment that will rapidly change over time as well. And so we could have the next slide. Sorry for jumping then. All right. So we perceived that what one needed to do was think about governance, because governance is your relationship primarily with the goals of the organization. Clearly, with a nuclear site, there is no argument about the need to manage risk. I mean, all organizations need to manage risk, but a nuclear site always has a much more important feature. It's a major hazard in many senses and should be treated in that line. Because we're talking about planning over a very long time, we need to be clear on the line of sight. So we don't, as I said before, we don't want to make an action now which will have repercussions and cause problems all the way down the line. So that in terms of thinking about what we do today, it will of course impact on what somebody does in 10 years, 20 years into the future. And then of course, one has to be doing it at a sensible cost. The value has to be brought together into the equation, because clearly the government, the exchequer, will want to have its view on what should be done. And they all have to be encompassed within the plan. They all have to be thought of within the plan long term. So you can see it's complex in not only in the site, in the organization, but also in the approaches that one has to think about in such circumstances. Next slide, please. Now, you know, governance has been going on for some time, and as usually driven by scandals that occur financially or in the context of organizations. But disasters also are important. And I actually think, I always have thought the Health and Safety at Work Act has been a major blessing in some senses, because it did actually say, well, all risk has to be appropriately managed by people who understand the risk. On the governance side, the scandals led to various things, Cadbury and Turnbull, and the movements into various risk approaches started developing. You know, enterprise risk management became the theme. No longer should we have silos. We should move forward and think of risk across the whole organization, which again was a positive step forward. Now, you know, over time, I've always found that there are a huge number of risk theories floating around. Normal accident theory or normal accidents, essentially an idea that came to the fore in the sense that it was realized that accidents were occurring for a variety of different reasons, but it depended how tightly you tried to defend against risks. If you were over restricted and you had everything lined up in a particular direction, then perhaps that was very fragile. However, if things were slightly looser, so that you had some tolerance within the system, that you organized things so that there were alternatives to one particular form, then of course we get normal accident theory giving us some impetus. And then following that, high reliability appeared. Let's make sure we follow up every fault and understand every fault. And by doing that, we will actually improve the situation. Well, of course, that became a little bit more silo orientated and people getting fixated in many respects. So the next blessing was enterprise risk management in that sense. You know, enterprise risk management was a solution to that, followed by resilience. So we can go on to the next slide, which says a little bit more. Yes, tight and loose coupling was what we got from normal accidents. It is this feature, it came from Diana Vaughan's ideas when she was looking at NASA, and she decided it was too narrowly faced, too focused on the mission and just keeping the mission and thing. So everything was tightly tied together. And she was advocating when maybe it would have been better to have a looser structure and wouldn't have had so many problems. High reliability is a great idea. And clearly, I do think one should monitor deviations, see what's changing, and I'll come back to that towards the end. And then enterprise risk management was a realization that silos don't work. If you are great, I mean, an example is the financial crisis, where some organizations went bust simply because their own financial teams in the banks were heading in the wrong direction. They were making profits while their own bank was going downhill, not appreciating the pressure they were putting on the system. And of course, resilience is now the order of the day, where we say, great, we can think about the defenses for the system, we can think about the whole totality of the system, and we can try and make sure that we can restore the system when it fails. And essentially, I think all have added to the theory of risk. They've all brought something to risk, but essentially they often finish up with a singular solution or are implemented as a singular solution. The alternative is they become too vague to be really successful. And I've looked at ERM and the desires for ERM over some time with some PhD students. And yeah, you can start looking at how do you quantify, how do you produce metrics for ERM? And you can start thinking, oh, they've got to have, what, 80 criteria to be satisfactory, they've complied with ERM. And you can show that if they do comply, they seem to be financially successful in many respects. They've thought about it, but one really wants to know what has actually been achieved. And one finance professor once said to me that the major feature, it was a discussion about software, and companies that had good software performed well. Well, he pointed out that companies that performed well could buy good software. And essentially, what is leading what? What are the goals and the aims at these things? So it's a much more nuanced situation to be in that sense, not as clear as some people like to think. And whilst it is desirable to get away from silos, to get better management, to be in line with corporate goal, sometimes it doesn't help that much. Next slide, please. Line of sight, simply I would say a project planning tool. It tackles the needs of a company when it has to think about making changes, and you can start thinking about the changes that are constantly happening within organizations and how they should be planned in. So you want a new facility to tackle a specific issue, you need it in a few years' time, so you've got to try and deliver it on time in the right location, and it's got to fulfill the right goal. And this is in a large nuclear project is not as simple as it may seem, particularly if it's on a congested site where you're going to have to build and knock down buildings throughout the actual decommissioning stages. So, you know, you can think about different uses of building, reusing buildings, but is that a solution if it's got a particular need a particular feature. And obviously there are always, with any major project, risks of delays, and in removing the buildings, building them, and actually failure to deliver the capacity that you actually really required to the timescale necessary. Next slide, please. Value thinking. Well, you need to make sure that you have a good price wherever you are. And I worked for some time with water companies, and their problem was that they always were trading off the replacement costs of an asset against its maintenance costs. But really, when you are considering an asset, you've really got to start at the beginning of its life, and that's the acquisition phase, and go through the whole of that process when you're trying to make the decision. And often people don't, because they think, oh, we need this, we'll build this, but they never think about now, which is more pressing, the issues about how do you demolish it in the long term, and what is going to be the cost of demolition. This is particularly true if you're trying to get as far along the passage as a greenfield site. Greenfield sites, you know, must by their nature be almost idealistic in their form. It was vastly appreciated when we started looking at the planning in this context that you have a large number of assets which are only going to increase in the short term, because new roles have to be brought in to a facility where the boundary is restricted. So you're going to have difficulties, and you need to think these things through. Next slide, please. But one of the more important features that is often forgotten about is bringing people into line. So the strategic asset management plan needs to influence both management and staff. It needs to actually impact on the mindset of management. It needs to convince management that what you are suggesting, what you are thinking about, will be for the benefit of the organization, and it is aligned with the organizational goals, missions. But of course, the aspect there is there needs to also to be a change amongst the staff, both in the types of skills they have. So you might retrain people, but you also need to think about those people who no longer fulfill a role that you require, and that you need to hire people. So there has to be a proper change management plan underpinning this major activity. And that means you need to look at organizational issues as well as the technical issues. It would be nice if we lived in a world where we could just order up people for specific lengths of time, but that's not how it works out there in practice. Let's move on again. Now, risk is paramount. There's no argument, particularly with a nuclear site. It is critical to success that nothing happens, no major incident occurs. And the positive thing about that is people are willing to spend money to ensure that there won't be any issues that go beyond the boundary, as one might say. But when one concentrates on certain features, then one tends to lose sight of the whole of the organization in terms of risk, because risk covers so many more dimensions. And look at the changes that we've all gone through in terms of COVID-19. It is something which some people, as usual, will have predicted, Bill Gates being one of them, that we'd have such a problem. but essentially, most of us would not have thought about a pandemic, even though we've had attempts at pandemics, SARS and MERS, in the past. It wasn't on the agenda. Then, of course, you know, resilience. Oh well, it's got an easy appeal. We're going to make it a resilient system, and it's going to solve all our problems. But as enterprise risk management showed, a lot of people wanted to implement enterprise risk management, but you know, compliance has always been a major issue, and essentially getting the right structures for compliance is fairly difficult. You know, making sure you've got everything in place is rather difficult, as I perceive it. We could go on to the next slide. Now, I can't find a reference to where the Danish risk expert actually. I saw a presentation at a conference, and I was always taken by it. And Rasmussen came up with this idea of drift, that over time things will drift. Think the environment changes. And, you know, I try to illustrate it in a simple way here, that initially you start off at the planning stage, and everything at planning stages is always so much perfect. Everything, you know you're in a huge space, you've got a lot of feasibility, and the boundaries are not that tight, and they're nice clean boundaries. There's no problems with those boundaries. You know, you can think how they might change over time. You may, you know, when it actually comes to implementation, you hit the reality. You hit the reality of the situation. So something that was economically very viable in one circumstance, after COVID might not be economically viable. And so suddenly the feasible region gets shrunk. The region in which you can operate shrinks. And in that sense, it becomes an issue. It's an issue of, again, thinking through into the future. What will happen? What are the things that are important within the organization? I think we can go on to the next slide. All right, so what we basically thought of as kind of a model, a very general model for the situation, because you've got the corporate vision and mission at the top, then you come down and you've got the portfolio level, strategic asset plan, program level, program level, project level. But you've got operational requirements and asset requirements, and these are all tied in with the ideas that we've had. So essentially we can go over to the next one, which is an advert for a course that we are planning at Edinburgh. We've had practitioners being involved, so the next slide would be useful. Strategic asset management for transformational impact. And this is where we actually bring a set of practitioners who've been our steering group, along with people who are academics and people who are actually physically still working with organizations in various roles. And also we bring in organizational studies people to try and say how is the best way to go through these different changes. So it's a whole complex set of people from a range of different backgrounds, giving us insight into large complex contexts. The public sector buildings in Scotland, airports and airport groups, various things of this ilk. And that's where I'm going to end on the advert. Okay.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Jake. Sorry, I had a bit of trouble there with the slides. They were kind of jumping around a little bit of their own accord. No, it was really interesting. I particularly like the normal accident theory. It's a really interesting subject. I like the idea of factoring in some flexibility to your plans to account for change as you kind of progress forwards.
Yeah, I think these are features that I mean, if you're trying to deal with complexity, the idea that things work as people expect them to work, or that actions around them aren't going to have an impact, is a mysterious idea to me. Essentially, we you know, as in education now, we've had to change radically. We've not necessarily helped our students in any sense, and we're now being attacked on so many different planes. It's unbelievable. 2 years ago, I would have been quite happy to continue teaching in the way I've been teaching for the last 40 years. And but now we're in a totally different ballpark, having to face different realities and try and satisfy different goals and ambitions.
Well, the next slide is just any questions. So if anybody's got any questions you'd like to put to Jake, now's your chance.
Jake, yeah, I've got it's an interesting thought. I can understand that the underlying rationale that complexity exists in the work that you're doing. Did you work at any sort of objective methods to actually get the complexity recognised within the strategic asset management plan? Anything that you could really sort of say moved it from being just a standard management plan into something that recognised those complexity factors?
We were working in a team where it did allow us to look at the whole organization in terms of the risk owners within the assets, so that essentially they were aware of the complexity and they were aware of the features. In terms of particular tools, no, we didn't get round to actually developing tools for that. What we were aimed at was developing a strategic asset management plan. And you're quite right, we should reflect more strongly on the kinds of elements that we brought together. Because one of the things we haven't really put in a formulaic sense, the approach is actually tying them so that you can see each of the elements, how it works within the actual thinking. We've still got it saying this is a bundle of things we're tying together, and we've got to be conscious that we're tying them together. This is a realization that we're going to have change within an organization, and how to get that change accepted within the organization, and how it's going to work. But no, you're quite right. One of the things we should reflect more heavily on is how complexity, or formal ways of looking at complexity, allow us to do. I mean, historically, I was in a group where they had systems thinking very strongly to the fore. I am not too convinced that sometimes that always is a helpful thing in many senses.
Yeah, so you can become perhaps a bit too rigid, too defined, can't it? You're trying to sort of create an objective structure out of something which is much more nebulous.
Well, that is a major feature, and that's why I mean, as somebody who works in risk, and I mean, when my students turned up, one looking at insurance companies and the other one looking at performance of firms on a stock exchange, and said, we want to look at enterprise risk management. I was saying to them, do you actually want to remain within that structure? You know, the people who created it had various thoughts of things they were trying to tackle, but it doesn't necessarily tackle the different problems. I've subsequently had somebody looking at airlines in the West Indies and North America, and yeah, whilst people want to be able to say we're compliant because it's like carrying a badge around with you, what does that compliance mean? Does that mean you're actually actively a good manager of the aforesaid risk that you're facing? and that you actually have got inherently resilience within the context, it probably doesn't. And if you apply, I mean, the IMA, the Institute of Asset Management, has very prescriptive set of rules about your status in organizations. They're trying to get away from it to a certain degree, but it's still much more prescriptive. But is that prescription going to work for all organizations? And are they going to be able to comply? And if you look, I mean, we did some modeling of this in terms of where people were on the IMA listing, and you know, quite frequently you find you're at the bottom end of it and you're having to crawl up to get to a higher level. But you then say, well, what does that really mean for my asset management? Does that mean that I have made success in moving it forward? Or what does it mean? And that's the thing I have with some of these prescriptions.
No, you're absolutely right. It's a bit like the old adage, isn't it? You know, does quality assurance assure quality?
It assures it to the extent that it actually meets the requirement we put on it in the first place. Yes. Great, wonderful. I think we've achieved something.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, well, we don't have any questions on the question panel, so we can move on, I think.
Okay. Cheers.
Yeah. Cheers for that, Jake.
Well, thank you very much, Jake.
Yeah, the next section then is looking at the APM PRAM guides, risk complexity chapter that's currently in draft form. So it's going to be an open forum. We'll run through it, or Mike will talk us through it, and you can pop any questions or comments you've got in the panel, the questions panel. So I'll just put that on the screen if you bear with me a moment.
So just as background to this, so this stemmed from a joint association meeting about, I think it was about 9 months ago. It takes a while for these things to actually develop momentum. But we had Institute of Risk Management, Association for Project Management, Institution of Civil Engineers, the Project 13 group were there, and I can't remember who else we had there. Faculty of Actuaries, who are co-authors of the RAMP guide, if any of you come across that. They did a sort of a summary of where they were heading, and what stemmed from it was really the desire to develop risk management guidance collectively rather than have individual guides. And one of the core things that came out was that IRM and APM agreed that they would co-develop the update of the PRAM guide. And I don't know whether you're all familiar with it, but it's quite a good text. It's been around for probably 15 years or more in various incarnations, and it's got some great stuff in there about managing risk at project level. So this is an update which is long overdue, and it's an opportunity for IRM and APM to align thinking on risk. And in doing that, they also asked for recommendations for what could enhance the guide, and one of them was primarily initiated by myself and Greg and Graham to say, well, let's move the debate forward, and let's move on from the last 25 years of risk management and start to recognise some new techniques, and one of them being appreciation of complexity. So we've drafted this, and we really wanted to get the SIG's perspective as to whether it's heading the right direction, whether it's pitched at the right level, and conscious. We've got about an hour or so to go through it, so we can explore ideas and do a bit of wordsmithing. But obviously, we don't want to get hung up on just one section. It'd be great to sort of look at it in its sort of total perspective as well. So I think, Graham, if you want to start throwing it up, are there any sort of immediate sort of questions so far in terms of what we're doing? I don't know whether can we open up the chat line so everyone can talk. Make sure everyone's involved. I don't know whether we can on this.
Yep, I think I've just opened up the forum, so I think people are free to chat now.
Hello, somebody talk to us. Make sure you're there.
Hello.
Ah, hello. Hello,
Good
Siobhan.
stuff.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, very well, very well. Good. Well, thanks for confirming that you can hear. Did you have a question as well, or?
No, it was just confirming.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. Great. All right. Well, I'll start to talk you through this, and please just chip in whenever you feel appropriate. I don't know whether you've had a chance to have a read through already, but if not, then this should be available to download for everybody now. So please take away a copy and look at it in more detail. I think we've got till the middle of May, so we've got another 2 or 3 weeks to just finalise a draft, and there'll be lots of opportunity to actually sort of develop the draft subsequent to that. But in terms of getting the sort of first piece, mainly to demonstrate to APM that there will be a chapter coming, and they can start to then put it into their overall context and understand how it comes together. But yeah, the key questions would be, or key comments would be great to get back in the next couple of weeks. So this is really sort of trying to pull together lots of the discussions we've been having over the last couple of months. Mark, did you have a question? No. Go on then, put it into the chat line if you can't, for some reason you can't talk. Mark, do you want to just put it in the chat? Oh, carry on. Okay. Right. Okay. So introduction, pretty obvious. I thought it'd be good to get a couple of quotes in there. If anybody's got any other examples, thought if we could get something from sort of well-recognized people, that would be good. And then most importantly, which is something we've been talking about for over a year now, is what we mean by complexity. And this section really starts to provide an introduction, sort of general concepts of complexity. I used this source, the risk management of projects, programs, and portfolios, as being quite a good, complexity management, because it refers to projects, programs, and portfolios. I thought that was particularly relevant for something that's going to go to the APM guide. So the focus obviously being projects. And APM is very keen to say it's not just sort of for the common termination, the common determination of projects. It's also interpreted as being programs, portfolios as well. So it's quite a good source, I thought. But it was interesting when you look at that definition that they have. Yeah, that's quite obviously just all projects. Every project we ever worked on is containing multiple parts, has a number of connections, and exhibits dynamic interaction. So what I wanted to do was try and move on from that. So I spoke about, well, actually, that's probably not what we would define as being complex. And probably because we actually have lots of formal management processes that get overlaid on that inherent complexity. It's a bit like sort of inherent risk to current risk, isn't it? That sort of concept. So then moving on to what I would offer as being a definition And this has had a bit of work. It's not just my work. I keep referring to it as just my work. It's Graham and Greg have also been involved in developing this. So between us, we came up with this definition. So a complex project has a volume and uniqueness of components and environment which are novel and or above the capacity of the team to determine cause and effect. So I'd just be interested in people's views as to whether that is a good definition, or is it a bit wordy, or any sort of thoughts on how that might evolve?
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Hi, yes. Hi, Robert.
Yeah, I just thought stakeholders might be mentioned somewhere in there. Complex projects. Been on most of the most difficult programs I've been on is because of the stakeholders involved, and you know, things like artificial intelligence. We're becoming in a world where there's the components there like that, but the complexity of things that we're managing. But it's the stakeholders and the requirements management of that. But I thought stakeholders might be something that possibly could be in there.
Yeah. No, interestingly, when I started to work out what we meant by volume, I certainly included stakeholders in that. But you'd suggest putting it into the definition as well?
I really feel that's probably one of the most biggest reasons. I mean, normally it's most possibly external stakeholders as well that, you know, aren't engaged correctly, and that's something that's, I believe, quite prominent.
Yeah.
Look at protesters, things like that.
Yeah. It's yeah, I agree with you. It certainly is a major feature, and the complexity of having to deal with all of those stakeholder groups. Okay.
Or requirements, something, you know, something along those lines of, you know, to components, requirements. It's another thing I wanted to say, stress is the evolution of these things. Sometimes you start these programs and, oh, now we want to do this, now we want to do that, and it's managing that as well. So yeah.
And the speed at which they evolve as well. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. We can't actually edit on the screen, but we're making notes, and what we'll do is we'll incorporate these comments into an update, and then if we can, we'll recirculate it to attendees. I think we can put another update onto the website. So if you're recorded as a participant, you should be able to get the update. Great. No, thanks for that, Rob. Any other comments on the definition?
The only the other, it's Rob again, sorry. The only thing I wanted to say, other thing I was going to add is where would something's being done that's unique, or, you know, really sort of like unique or one of a kind, that sort of stuff, where there's no information or you know, detail on what's being done, reference classes, etc.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's definitely in there. So we've spoken about the volume and uniqueness of components and environment. I think you're absolutely right. There was interesting. There is a quote in this text actually, which says that all first of a kind are inherently. I think it actually refers to them as being inherently chaotic, which I thought was probably a bit excessive. I think you know, we wouldn't say they were chaotic if they've been properly planned. There will be unknowns to a greater extent, but I think I would classify, and it'd be interesting to people's views, that first of a kind should be considered complex rather than chaotic.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that.
Okay, so we'll move on, shall we? And just this definition is then broken down into its constituents. So be good to get your thoughts on how this is done. Can you go to the next couple of pages?
There we go.
There we go. Right. So here's this. So the crucial characteristic of complexity being causes difficult to trace, consequences difficult to determine, both the sort of the immediate impact and then subsequent impacts, and then these additional systemic risks. And we felt this was a really important point, because it's this additional component of risk which starts to mean that standard risk analysis and standard risk management starts to fall apart. So I think this is quite a useful section. Subdividing complex and chaotic, I think, is good. I think if we're talking to project managers and saying you can stay out of chaos if you do something more, if you recognize complexity, I think that's probably a very sort of useful hook to have in here. And then talking about what that might be, so this enhanced risk management. So your standard processes are probably not going to be adequate, but you can use standard risk management process to justify additional investment. So then what we did was okay, let's take the standard risk management approach. Let's take identification, assessment, and then management as being the three sort of core components of risk management, and talk about each of those stages in terms of what complexity might mean for them. So under identification, what we've got here is saying, you know, this isn't that standard risk identification isn't appropriate. You know, you can use standard techniques such as PESTLE, and obviously this will be explored more in the PRAM guide. They have whole sections on different techniques, so we wouldn't need to cite lots of different techniques in our piece. But then starting to think about, okay, what are the components that we've identified as being constituents of complexity, one being volume. So what would we do to flesh out identification of volume? So if you want to click on another page, Graham. So it'd be interesting to see whether you think this is useful. What we've done in each phase is actually put some sample questions down. So just to trigger people's thinking, and be great for you to just have a thought as to whether these are the right questions, whether they're, you know, we could probably identify lots and lots, but in terms of just sort of 3 or 4, do you think these are right? And it's interesting, this is where I put in stakeholders, Rob. So you know, I did have a number of stakeholders in here as part of a volume consideration, but I take your point. It's not just the volume; it's also, you know, how vociferous they are, how animated, or just how convoluted they are. So I think it's probably worthy just to flesh that out.
Yeah, it's that thing. It's not just that. It's sometimes the time, and you know, that they change. You know, the how many come and go, the replacements and things. Churn is the word I'm looking for. The churn of stakeholders, where people come in and have a focus on something, you know, different, or want to do something differently, or focus on specific requirements, etc.
And then there's
that's a very good point. Yeah.
Is there also anything here? Sorry, it's Siobhan Crawford speaking. Around the dependencies that rely on the project being delivered. So in the sample questions to of the complexity thinking.
What were you thinking there, Siobhan? Yeah, sounds like an interesting idea.
So obviously, if we're talking about a project being delivered in isolation, you know, it has its own project's objectives, and they're all really important. But some of the kind of, you know, major projects out there, there's a key kind of dependency on them being delivered. Sorry. So obviously, if you take Crossrail, it had all of the economic benefits, you know, the movement of people through the city. So is there something to be considered on actually what is the project delivering, and, you know, what other stakeholders are relying on that delivery? So if it's delayed, you know, what is the impact, or if there's any failures, you know, does that determine a higher kind of complexity of the project that's being delivered?
Yes, yeah, no, good point. And actually, what you're saying about that in terms of interdependency between one project and lots of other projects. Yes, that's and that introduces a whole new raft of stakeholders and requirements.
In fact, it's Robert here. Thanks very much for that. And a point that's it. Sometimes it's the pressures from the portfolio management side as well, and from a stakeholder point as well. Yeah, good point.
We've got a question in the question box from Sachin. Is there going to be a complexity and uncertainty breakdown structure? So stimuli and impacts potentially.
Hadn't put one in now, but if you could provide an example of that sounds like something which would be very useful in the analysis side to enable people to actually sort of get their head around those complexity factors.
Yeah, I think that ties into what Siobhan was saying as well, relating to identifying cascading projects.
Just to elaborate on the point, you know, if you think in terms of the risk bow tie, you have you know, your cause and your effect side on the either side of the risk event. Many organizations have a risk taxonomy. I was just wondering whether, you know, with the new risk software, you can create alternative breakdown structures, and whether you wanted to, the game plan here was to do that. And then also with respect to the point about Project 13, whether the plan was to go towards you know, funding envelope which wasn't based on point estimates. So I'm not quite sure if that was the game plan which was being envisaged here.
Well, certainly if we can, I mean, it's interesting. We're alluding here to the bow tie being one of those sort of simple approaches. Doesn't really work for complexity because it assumes the linear relationship between cause, risk, and effect. So I was interested if anybody's got any some sort of diagram that we could illustrate complexity operating in a more complex way than bow ties. That would be great. In terms of the funding envelope side, no, we're not covering that. That I think that's probably, I don't know whether, I mean, PRAM will have a section on contingency, so we can see how they're incorporating the Project 13 requirements into that. But I hadn't anticipated us moving towards suggesting that how you would incorporate complexity into additional contingency, if that was your thought.
Just asking a question. Thank you. I'll shut up now.
No, please, no. I mean, this is an open discussion, so no, thank you for contributing. Okay, so again, food for thought when you look at this in the quiet light of day in terms of whether the questions are the right ones, but definitely sort of homing in on you know, what would catalyze a risk workshop if you wanted to get them to really sort of understand complexity and underneath the four headings of volume, uniqueness, novelty, and then the team capability. So I'll carry on going through it, and then yeah, shout out if you've got any further thoughts.
Just before you move on, Mike, there's a comment. I'm not sure who made it, but it's saying that linear bow ties are a poor visualization for complexity, and that graph networks are more appropriate.
A what network? A graph network?
Graph networks, yeah.
Okay. Well, if anyone's got an example of that, if the person that raised that has got an example, that'd be great to put in. It's interesting because this is, I think that might be similar to the approach Network Rail's taking when they're presenting their risks. Don't know whether we've got anybody from Network Rail on, but I know the corporate risk registers are moving towards much more sort of neural networky type presentations with interaction of risk rather than just linear risk registers. Definitely seems to be grabbing the attention of the Network Rail exec more than standard linear risk registers.
Yeah, it was Mark Turner who made the comment. He said he's got lots of imagery available.
Oh, brilliant. No, thank you, Mark.
So I've got the tiniest little window that only shows me like a snippet of the list of questions, so it's tricky to see them in their entirety. Yeah, I think we've covered it all.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks for that, Graham. Yeah, and I'm sorry everyone can't talk. I don't quite know why that's happened, but oh, wait a minute. There's a control here that says unmute all attendees.
Yeah,
I think you've done
that's
that already, haven't you, Graham?
Yeah, I've done that. So I thought
Yeah.
everybody would be free to talk.
Well, please just shout if you can, or yeah, put your words into the chat, and we'll try and get to them. So uniqueness of components was the next stage, and I try to sort of steer away from it just being physical components, but you know, there's also sort of software components which feed in. Oh, I'm getting some feedback now. And then this key factor, which is the uniqueness of those individual components. So moving away from anything that's standard towards, and this is where clearly the first of a kind type approach comes in. But I also wanted to cover that it's known components being used in a different way. You know, we're seeing a lot of that coming out of more sophisticated engineering practices that obviously, you know, using more advanced computing to generate much more novel ways of using standard materials. So the core questions that are here are, you know, physical components that are unusual, technological advancements. I do actually refer to first of a kind here, but obviously, you know, trying to say that clearly adds complexity, but you know, if you can manage it, then it's not going to be chaotic. And then the unusual engineering or architectural details. The next section was the uniqueness of the environment, and I used environment deliberately, sort of just to encompass lots of different perspectives on environment. So it could be geography, it could be socio-political, or it could be economic, and there's probably others as well. With a little silly example, I know, but just to try to make the point that, you know, the same project being delivered in Antarctica would be far more complex than one being delivered in mainland Europe. So then the questions are about whether projects have been delivered before in these environments. It's interesting. I think Rob, you mentioned it about you know, stakeholders having particular sort of interference with projects, and I was trying to allude to that here in whether there are characteristics that make it particularly susceptible to disruption. I was thinking sort of terrorism or even protest groups. And then another one, which is, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say there's a point here. There are emerging, so this is from Mark Turner again, there are emergent behaviours which cannot be guessed at from starting conditions. So it's a kind of human element, I think.
Hi Mike, it's Mark. I managed to find a computer that's working.
Oh, well done, brilliant.
Yeah. Now that comment was from earlier when we were talking about the characteristics of what constitutes a complex behaviour, and that is that you can't determine the emergent behaviours from the starting conditions, which I think is quite a fundamental. That's the whole sort of the chaos theory backing into the level of complexity. What I wanted to say about this uniqueness of environment is when we start looking at complexity of things like supply chains and investor relationships, and the fact that we've got investors who are supplying and suppliers who are investors, and there is so much dynamic relationships between the extended enterprise in which we work, that I think, you know, that whole economic complexity is as much an environmental consideration as anything else.
No, that's a good point, Mark. Yes. And that I did put some words in about that interconnectedness of the supply chain that I know you're very strong on, but yeah, you're right. I don't think the link about your supply chain being your investors and being different stakeholders simultaneously has been drawn out. So I think that's a really good point. All right, I am writing all these down. Don't worry. So the next draft will incorporate them.
Yeah, I'm doing the same.
Let's compare notes. All right. So the next stage was novelty. So and again, this is where you start to see some overlap. So the uniqueness has also got some sort of novelty factor in. But do you want to just click onto the next page, Graham?
Yeah.
So novelty, we're talking about the collective team. Well, I think just flick back to the previous page. Yeah. So here I was talking about individuals' experiences and wanted to make the point that individuals aren't just picked for projects, but they're likely to be based on their previous experiences. But now you can go on to the next page. But actually, that's a sort of an individual experience rather than a collective understanding. So the knowledge will be on particular aspects, but the entire system probably is not well understood, and certainly not collectively understood. And then the other useful component of that is that will tend to compound bias. So all the other stuff that Kahneman talks about in Thinking Fast and Slow. So the inherent sort of bias that exists within project teams to generally be optimistic around success, that will probably be compounded in complex projects. For not only because the understanding of the total circumstances is probably not as great, but also because the external awareness is much more focused on the bigger projects, the more complex projects. So that might introduce a component of suppression of information, because they don't want the press to pick up on any shift from expectations. And we know this is a common factor in all projects, but it's just highlighting that in complex projects it's likely to be compounded. So 3 questions though on thinking about novelty. So have all the key parties delivered something that's comparable? What significant individual experience is being relied on? It's quite interesting on some of the big complex projects I've worked on. There were technical issues that always referred to one person, and generally quite a sort of a mature person, and they could never go into retirement because they became the sort of font of knowledge for so much of the design parameters. And then one around the bias.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, yeah. Hi, Rob.
Hi, Rob, sorry again. No, just here, on the novelty side of things, a good point, just from what you just mentioned, was about succession planning. Like you said, are there individuals that could be make or break, for the project program? That was just come to mind. So I don't know whether it was worth noting that.
That's good. How do you capture their knowledge, carry it forward?
Succession planning, knowledge capture, yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Excuse me, could I ask a question about the skills? It talks about significant individual expertise, but in my experience with these complex projects, often they're forging into new areas and the skill sets aren't necessarily available. So are we making an assumption here that all of the key parties are going to have all of the skills needed, or will we need to do some development or buy in those extra skills?
It's a really good point. Yes.
Yep, things like sorry, it's Robert. Just again, things like training or apprentices, that sort of stuff. Yeah, great point.
I'm also thinking about, you know, when we're moving more into digitalization, you know, do we have the skills to develop those apps or whatever else might be needed, especially with AI, etc.
Yes, that's a really good point, actually. Yes, yeah, if we're pushing the boundaries, do the skills exist? Yeah, have we got to invent new methods to acquire those skills? Yeah.
Thank you.
No, thank you for that. And interesting, that leads on to the capacity of the team. I think it may well be that the skill set comes in the capacity of the team as well. Certainly knowledge management would come in there, wouldn't it? This is really talking about the finite capacity of teams being able to handle issues arising. And it's interesting because this is then starting to play into this boundary between complex and chaos. And yeah, it's interesting. I was used to say that project managers used to love dealing with crises because they could be firefighters. Maybe that's a historic perspective, but clearly we want to try and avoid them being crisis managers.
It's Rob here. Just on point number 2, it says what management bottlenecks exist. Possibly we could rephrase that: exist or could exist.
Yeah.
And I think somebody mentioned earlier about dependencies, and I often find that and I think someone just mentioned it as well, you know, the one person who needs to be involved in lots of aspects of the project or all projects, creating resource bottlenecks, not just management bottlenecks, but maybe access to skilled resources bottlenecks.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. Yeah.
It's just Rob here again. The other thing here was to do with the location of the project. Sometimes I don't know where would that fit in with the capacity of the team. You know, whether
that was under environment.
Oh, environment. Okay.
Yeah, but no, you're right in terms of the ability of competent teams to get to those locations. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, it's Mark here. There is a point there to be raised about whether the team is co-located or if it's disparate. Because I think, you know, I've worked in teams which are actually spread all around the world and they're in different time zones, and that adds a degree of complexity to a situation.
Sometimes it helps it too.
Oh, absolutely. You can run 24/7 if that's the case.
Well, I think the last 12 months have proved how well people can work from remote locations.
Yeah. Well, I've certainly been in a project where we handed off after 12 hours to the team in Australia, and then they handed off to us 12 hours later.
Yes. Yeah.
Great point.
Okay.
Speaking of Australia, I'm connected to you from Australia, and I'm curious when I'm listening to what you're saying is in defining complexity. Have you used systems like Dave Snowden's Cynefin approach to look at the difference between complexity and simply complicated? Because it makes quite a difference. In fact, as Jake pointed out, a lot of the issues of complexity actually arise from people, almost inevitably arise from people, and the crazy stuff people do, or the things people do. And if you can separate out the parts that are merely complicated, then you can focus on the bits that actually will cause the project to spiral into complexity and possibly into chaos.
Yeah, no, we've been mulling over the difference between complexity and complication for quite a few months actually, and this was definitely trying to not get into that sort of confusion again, and just highlight complexity being this interaction between unpredictable components.
Sorry, it's Mark again. I think the gentleman from Australia makes a very good point, though, and that in the introduction, where there should be some pointer for this guide as to the difference between simple, complicated, complex, and then the chaotic. Just even if it just says this document focuses purely on the complex aspect of this. Quite an interesting continuum of simplicity to chaotic.
Yep. No, that's a good point. As you say, there are some good texts already on that, so we can put in a little hook and then link through to a reference.
Hi, it's Rob
Okay.
again. It's just on the capacity wise. I'll just all the talk here, but just that comment there from Simple Talk is sometimes, you know, are people going to stay for the whole duration of the program? So churn again, like I mentioned before, things like that. I don't. I think that is the capacity of the team.
Yeah, and obviously that's a symptom of longer programs, that it's very rare for people to stay. Yeah.
And like I said, especially if it's like we discussed before, where commutes are long distances, etc., like that, it does sort of like take its toll.
Yeah.
I take sort of like commitment, isn't it? Or was it commitment? Well, it's hard to know. It's one or the other, isn't it? Sometimes, you know, someone's done 2 years, 3 years on a program. Is that good? Is it 5 years, 10 years, etc.?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think we need to refer to it as commitment, do we?
Yeah.
It's just one of the factors that people don't tend to stay with projects for longer than 5 years max.
Well, yeah, I've been on some programs where it's known that it's there's a 90% chance people will leave within 9 months. You know, things like that. You know, not because of the other factors, nothing to do with the and it is that, you know, you do get those instances on complex programs due to.
Well, yes. I mean, there's maybe a whole other factor in there about how complexity does make it harder to work. You know, it's that difference between you know, it's almost like crisis management, isn't it? It exhausts you quicker than standard management, doesn't it? And complex projects are potentially more exhausting. So yeah, which means people would want to move on.
Mike, it's Mark. Just a question about the actual title of this. We've talked about capacity, but we're actually talking about capability in some degree here.
Well, yes, no, that's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, I think capability would be better, wouldn't it? Good.
Possibly need both in there, because in my experience, both of those activities create the biggest problems.
Yeah, I don't that wouldn't be a problem at all, would it, to call it capacity and capability? Yeah.
No, I think that would be correct.
Brilliant. Okay. So then there was a section on the assessment and an analysis of complexity, and just a simple diagram just to illustrate how the number of connections increases dramatically the more nodes you have, and hopefully that's a sort of nice simple diagram that conveys that point. And then going on to the next page.
I mean, Mike, just that diagram, as simple as it is, does it does belie the level of complexity, because where you've got one link between two nodes, that could potentially be bidirectional, and so directionality in these things has got a high influence over the level of complexity. So even a two-node one link, if it was a bidirectional or a unidirectional link, that actually becomes an order of magnitude more complex, than just a simple diagram.
Absolutely, and I think I made that point in on the next page.
Oh, okay, all right.
Did I put it in there? Oh, well, I think I must have dropped it out. No, I definitely wanted to make the point about directionality and also the sequence in which you go through the nodes. So yeah, I'll add that back in.
Yeah, I remember us talking about it, Mike.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, when you start thinking about the sequence, then you can get into infinite numbers of alternative worlds.
Well, that's it. I mean, that's where you end up talking about optimized results and optimization of the system rather than it being a perpetually simulated system, for example. So optimization is something which it becomes I mean, appreciate that this isn't a technical document, you know, a thesis on it, and you don't really want to dive into too many rabbit holes. But there are so many facets to this discussion. It's going to be difficult to just be sure that we give it the level of credibility that's required, whilst providing the readers of it. And we should always think first and foremost who's the intended audience for this. And I'm expecting it to be the project manager and the project risk manager. But this should be, in my opinion, it should be a direction pointer as to where they could find more information about these things should they want to look further.
Yeah. Yeah, so now this is I'm glad you raised that, Mark. So firstly, we can put more references into this. So if there's a really good sort of authoritative text that you think would be worth linking in here, then we should do that. But also, what I've also done is said that we, as the IRM Special Interest Group, maintain a compendium of tools, techniques, resources, and with my fingers crossed, I'm sort of saying that's obviously a secretariat responsibility. So Graham will clearly be doing that. Well, you know, we have said we were going to do this, so I'm tongue in cheek in sort of saying it's Graham's accountability. We do need to start doing this, and I think, you know, we've had some good presentations from people over the last year and a half, and it would be good to have all these into sort of, you know, a library that that people can refer to.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, kind of flesh out our references a bit and create a reading list separately as well would be really useful.
Yeah. Yep. And then people that are offering tools and techniques, like I mean, I mentioned Nodes and Links and NPlan here, who both given presentations, but yeah, we should be developing sort of connections with other companies that have tools that can be used as well. So yeah, so what else to draw out from this? So I wonder if another diagram would be useful here, if anybody's got any thoughts about different diagrams, just to sort of explain how you analyze complexity. That would be really useful. We could potentially put in the difference between symmetry and asymmetry and risk analysis, but I think that's maybe a little simplistic. I don't know. What do people think? We could definitely expand this section, but I'm worried that we're already running at about sort of 6 or 7 A4 sides. So we might be asked to reduce it anyway. But I think perhaps if we get a good draft which we're all comfortable with, and if that's lengthy, then if we do get cut down, then we can have another discussion about what gets cut from it. But yeah, I've referred to sophisticated techniques like artificial intelligence, machine learning. There was that gentleman that gave him a presentation back in October, I think it was, Graham, which had he was talking about complex systems in banking.
Yeah.
We could potentially put a diagram of his in, but it might be over complex. And AI and neural networking, I mean, there's lots of other guides to that anyway.
Yes, it's Rob here. one thing was one was trying to get hold of people when you're trying to do analysis and assessment, and one thing was that, and the other thing was so availability. The other thing was how exponentially decision making and the time grows. But those were the things I didn't know whether they were in the first few paragraphs to add in.
Say that again, Rob. I wasn't quite sure I got that.
What one was availability of people. So we said about it says here things can spiral out of control, but it's just availability of. I'll give you an example. Just getting the time for a risk meeting, monthly risk meeting. Out of 10 people, 6 might not be able to make it. Then 7, and you're just trying to get hold of people. So that was one, availability of people. I think a high level thing. And the other one was the decision making. The process of decision making grows exponentially. I haven't seen that. I don't think mentioned.
Yes, and something that's occurred to me while you've been talking as well about the complexity of accountability as well. Who actually makes decisions? Yeah.
The other thing as well is not getting the right people to assess it. So getting the wrong, that sort of stuff, because they're not available and having to make, and not making the best. So it's those exactly that. Who's accountable and who's the best person to assess.
Yeah. Very good. Okay. And then the final section, which I wonder whether we should extend as well, but this was about response. So,
sorry, it's Rob. Sorry, just what you said about accountability was just defining the owners of not just the risk, but of the mitigations as well. That's one of the biggest problems as well, I find. Getting the right person to take ownership of the mitigation in addition to the owner of the risk.
And what would you say?
Sorry, it does not drive into responses. Yeah.
And I mean that's a common issue with risk management. Do you think we can draw out something that makes that particularly hard in our complexity world? We come back to that accountability issue again, that it's hard for people to have that linear accountability for decisions.
Not just that linear accountability, but just visibility of things like organisation structures, etc., to be able for you to get or contact or obtain the correct person, and those lines of communications, very complex.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Because what you do suffer in complex projects and programs is that the structures are all intertwined, aren't they? Yeah.
And then you've got commercial considerations. So there's there are boundaries between contractors and employers, for example, where the flow of information is kind of hindered by that. There should be more collaboration and more kind of assignation of mitigation actions across the fence, so to speak.
Yeah. In fact, I've been on a project where the most complex thing was to try and find your counterpart, in the other organisation that you were assuring. Another one, if you want a quick joke, is we used to joke we were on a program within the same company. It was literally, the joke was, we're throwing it over the wall, to the other country, because we didn't have any, links between them. But it's sometimes extremely difficult, even within the same company, to find the correct people.
Yes. I did talk about contracts in the last section, actually, but there's I haven't. I think you're right. I think there's something more we could put in about contracts creating another layer of complexity, because they create artificial boundaries between organisations, accountabilities,
and also the subcontracting of those contracts. There are some organisations that literally fixed price subcontract things out and don't care, because if that something happens, they'll just sue the subcontractor, and it's like you said, it's very difficult sometimes.
Yeah.
Mike, it's Mark here. I do think we need to be very careful around some of these points, because what you're describing there are complicated things that can be resolved. Yeah. And the complexity would come in where there are relationships between third parties which are having possibly either an cumulative, additive effect or a detrimental effect. So it's not just a simple case of saying, I don't know who it is I'm talking to. You know, and whilst I appreciate, and I've experienced it myself, that is a difficult thing to overcome, that in its purest sense isn't a complexity issue. Where it becomes a complexity issue is if I've got a third party supplier who's also been invested in by another company who are investing in me, and there's a conflict of interest. That's when things start getting complex, because of the interrelationships between organizations. So there is a quite a clear differentiator between what is a complicated and difficult thing to do and what is a complex problem which has got emerging properties due to the relationship nature.
Yeah, no, good point. I think Rob's point about the commercial agreements adds a level of complexity, because it's not always, it's not in parallel with other structures which exist. So you're getting more and more interaction between organizations. I agree with you. A contract should be just a complicated thing, shouldn't it? But
yes.
But
Yes.
the nature of contracts in their entirety for a large program is usually something which lawyers end up earning a fortune over.
They certainly do. But yeah, from the purist perspective, and sometimes I've fallen back into that maybe too much, but from the purist perspective, these things which have got a linearity to them aren't necessarily complex from a complexity science perspective. They're complicated, but remain complicated regardless.
Yeah. No, good point. So yeah, I agree. So we just need to be careful about how we word that.
Mm.
Yeah, good.
Sorry to interrupt. That's a really good point. And when you talked about your definitions at the beginning of this chapter, do we need to make that distinction between complex and complicated, just so that it really does call it out?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think that was the comment that Mark was making earlier.
Mike, would you like me to pen something from my experience on that?
That would be great. Yes.
Yeah, I'll try and keep it brief but factual.
Excellent. Thank you.
I'd obviously appreciate some feedback to see whether or not it strikes the right tone on that. Yeah.
No, definitely. And all of this, I really appreciate people putting in some time to contribute to it. So it can be, we spoke, didn't we, right from the start about having a thought piece, and I think if we end up getting curtailed for PRAM, we've got the basis for a really good thought piece here. So we can all contribute to it and set our own timescale to finesse it. The final stage was response, and I think this could be stronger, so it'd be good to get your views. But it was really talking about responding to complexity. We've got to enhance normal risk management. So we're probably looking at network-based solutions. We're probably looking at solutions that address underlying behaviours and cultures rather than standard risk management, I dare say it, which refers to specific causes. So I then started to try and flesh out some specifics. So flag the risks that contribute to complexity. Do you want to flick on, Graham? Now this was my only reference to contracts, really, that paying particular attention to collaborative management and response. And this could allude to alliancing, collaborative forms of contract. We could actually put that in here, but that might be a stretch too far. Establish early warning signs for any ripple effect, and then just to reinforce that we're trying to stop projects from moving into crisis phase. So actually what you could use is you could use crisis management techniques just to sort of test the boundaries. And sort of what I love that comes out of crisis management tests is that team understanding of how to operate when they really are having to operate dynamically and bend some rules, adapt tools and techniques to be able to respond to the crisis. So learning from those experiences, I think, could potentially help us in complex situations as well. I think there's more we could put in here. Be great to hear your thoughts.
I really like the point that was made earlier. I don't know who made it, but it was in relation to adding human behaviour to a situation makes it complex, or can tip it over from complicated to complex. That's good to try and get across.
Yeah, so training in that. Projects that actually take their teams away and train them in collaborative behaviours are more likely to be successful. So that's probably something we can allude to in responding to complexity.
I think possibly this comes under the environment aspect, and that is there's something to be said about the increasing complexity because of other parties. So take Crossrail, for example, and you've got the protesters who are digging themselves their own tunnels and trenches. Yeah. Our standard projects, look at the things which are generally within our remit and our control. And there are these things which, sure, it might appear as a single line on the risk register, but the way that they have of increasing the degree of complexity, having a third party involvement, which wasn't actually part of the team, they're part of the problem, not the solution. I don't know if there's something to be said about that in the environments aspect.
Yes, yeah. That awareness of things outside. Outside the immediate,
maybe not applicable to sort of large infrastructure, but I'm from an aerospace background, so competitive analysis and what the competition are up to is also something which I don't think we pay enough attention to from a risk management perspective. And it's all well and good you putting your plans down, but what if your competition comes along and steals a march on the market?
Not just competition, but techniques. Things like techniques and things like that.
Absolutely.
Tools, techniques, things like that.
Yeah. Okay. Just trying to think how we could phrase that.
Well,
so
the phrase I've seen in the IRM before has been the extended enterprise. And extended enterprise would generally think about those things which go from the supply chain through to the customer and the end user. But you can also look at that in parallel with third parties' involvement in your enterprise as well.
Yes. I wrote an article for that. Yeah.
Well, you should know all about it then, Mike.
That's a few years ago now. God.
That was with Keith Smith, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. Yeah.
Yeah,
I wrote the article on
remember
Terminal 5. Yeah. No, it's good. Yes. Okay.
I was going to say something, but possibly someone here along. We mentioned about complex things like, we mentioned about external awareness, but things like even awareness of like black swan events and things like that. When you're doing these things exactly like that, like the protesters and things like that, way beyond what you would expect from a normal project.
Yeah. Yes, yeah, because I mean that should just be a standard part of risk management. I think there's lots of good stuff coming out now that says, you know, you shouldn't ignore low probability, high impact risks. But yeah, that's sort of the greater propensity to cause damage to complex projects. Yeah.
Can I ask, is there something in here about, especially multi-year projects, that there should be some kind of assessment of whether it's still the right thing to be doing? Because I can see how you could get very much onto a track that says we've started so we'll finish, but actually if it goes over a number of years and you know, the external world changes, the internal world changes, how are we making sure that this is getting reassessed?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yes, and that whole sort of management of change takes on a whole new dimension, doesn't it?
Yeah, because I think it's not about managing what the deliverable is in front of us or this next 6 months. It's about whether or not we really should be doing this at all now.
Yes.
Is that more portfolio management at all, or?
It's proportionate to length, isn't it? It's that if we say that complex projects have an attribute that is length of time to deliver, then those have a greater likelihood of not only suffering from change but also becoming dislocated from later business drivers.
I'll take the example of high speed 2 and the phase 2 ABs that are going on, other things that are going on, and they're being assessed as you're going on with benefits, etc. And that's changing, isn't it? Quite quite a lot lately. Which one's being prioritised, etc. Which one provides value for money.
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
Can I ask a bit of a basic question? I'm just scanning through the PDF document. I've managed to open that now as well. Are we using the word risk in its appropriate form in terms of equal to threats and opportunities? Because there hasn't been a mention of the word opportunity specifically in this, and I'm hoping that risk constitutes both, but there are opportunities to emerge from a complex situation as well.
Well, I'm hoping I haven't fallen into the trap of only considering it as being negative. I think it's innate human ability that when one's writing about risk, one tends to think of it as being just the threat side. But I don't think anywhere I've been overt on that. But yeah, I will double check it. It's certainly intended to be neutral.
I'm not saying anything jumps out at me at the moment. I'm saying I'm scanning through the PDF, but providing as long as risk in its purest terms means threats and opportunities, then it's perfectly fine. If this has been written from the threat perspective, then I'm wondering if there is even in the introduction, to make that clear that opportunities do emerge from complex situations.
Yeah, I think you're right. We were given a 3-line whip that when we were invited to contribute to this, myself and Graham were told that risk had to be both threat and opportunity. So we would have our hands chopped off if we did fall into that trap.
Absolutely. Good stuff. No, thank you for clarifying that, Mike.
In the response section, one thing I just wanted to add was, on a lot of these ones, when they're complex, is timing and decision making is often of the essence. Far more intense and rapid than normal programs projects. To know whether that need to be put in the first 2 bullet points at the beginning, something along those lines.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because actually, in hindsight, you tend to find that if there is more time to make decisions, but you're right, it's that it's that balance between knowing what time you've got, and then if it is a short period, to be able to make decisions quicker. Yep. And again, that's standard. That's standard for all projects, isn't it? What's the dimension for complex projects?
I just think something, I've done a lot of work in military, defence and government, and sometimes, behaviours, and, once these things have, decisions been made, you can't change it, or, you have to go with that decision, etc. Do you see what I mean? That sort of stuff on the more complex ones. Or is that complicated? I don't know.
Yeah, I'll have to have a think about that and see. I agree. I think there is something there. I'm just trying to work out what the dimension is for what makes it. What can we say around decisions in a complex?
I think sometimes, say look, on a risk on a smaller project, you'll be able to terminate that risk, whereas on the complex ones, you may well not be able to, and have a residual which you'll have to manage. Do you see what I mean? I think the ability to terminate threats. Well, I don't want to mention, or the ability to convert or terminate.
Yeah.
Is there something as well here about, because of the complexity and probably the scale of this, that you may have to accept or make decisions to accept maybe suboptimal elements in order to get, for the greater good? Because I think, sometimes you don't always deliver everything you were planning to, and you end up with the business having to maybe take on workaround processes or something else. But that still needs to be, discussed and decided to give them something less than that perhaps was the ultimate aim, because that enables you to deliver on time, or to deliver the wider program.
Yes. Yeah, that's an interesting component, isn't it? That the complexity means you can't actually deliver it as anticipated. There's a gap between expectations and what eventually comes out. Yeah,
it comes down to being able to satisfy everybody to their full satisfaction, and there's trade-offs, isn't there? And it's about trying to find the optimum solution where you satisfy the most people with the most, but there's still going to be some people who are disappointed.
Yes. Great. Well, I think I've written more words in notes than was in the document now. So I'm going to have to spend some time just sort of crafting these in. But that was really useful. No, thank you very much for that. So what we'll do, Graham and I will have a go at redrafting this, and then yes, if you're happy to be involved in a further iteration, that would be great. We'll try and get the document posted up on the website. If not, we should be able to get your email addresses out of the Institute, and we can send an email directly to you all with an updated draft, and get your comments.
Mike, do you want me to write you to directly with my words for the complexity versus complicated?
That would be marvellous. Yes, thanks a lot for that, Mark.
I think I've got your direct email address, haven't I? We've spoken since you left last year.
Well, for you and anybody else who wants to get in touch, it's Mike at Trifolium, TRIFOLIUM.limited Ltd. And feel free. Oh yeah, there you go. Brilliant. All right. Well, thank you very much for that. We've got 10 minutes. Graham, have you got any other closing thoughts?
No, just no, I think that's us. Just to say thanks very much for everybody's time and contributions, and thanks especially to Jake as well. It was really interesting stuff.
And if anybody's got any ideas, we'll probably try and set up another one. Unless people want an extraordinary one just to go through this document, we could set that up. But then the next one, as being a special interest group, would probably be in about 6 months' time. So if anybody's got any thoughts about a speaker, please let Graham or myself know, and we can develop thoughts as to where we've got to with the PRAM guide, and have 1 or 2 additional speakers as well.
Sounds good.
Good, thanks,
All
Mike.
right.
Appreciate it.
All right. Anybody else got any final comments? If not, gain 10 minutes back. You see, the risk side has upsides as well. That's brilliant. All right. Well, thank you. I'll try and get an updated draft to you as soon as I can. But watch out for it next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Graham.
Cheers, Mike. That was really good. I'll catch up with you separately then.
Yeah. All right. No, that'd be good. Yeah. Let's try and find some time later on this week to have a chat.
Stuff. Okay. Cheers for that.
All right. All right. You take care then. All right.
You too. All right. See you. Bye.
Bye.
Yes.